Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry you're having to listen to this today. If you're listening to this means that our service day was canceled because of weather. And you've already taken your first map test. I promise I will have those graded by the next time we have class. And I know many of you are not mentally prepared for the day because you are anticipating a service day. But it is what it is, and we move on. And let me explain what we want to get accomplished today. Well, you've already taken care of one thing, and that is you've taken your map test today already, and I hope you did well. The second thing I'd like you to do today is I'd like you to take notes off of this taped lecture I have for you. And then once you have taken the notes you need from this lecture, I need you to read several pages in your textbook and answer some questions. Over the few days that we've had together, we have looked at maps, and we have focused on maps and the different kinds of maps that there are that geographers use. We are now going to take that information and apply it into real-world settings. Before we can do that, I need to give you some information about the history of African Americans in the United States, focusing solely upon where traditionally have African Americans lived in our country. So take out your notebook. If you need to put this on pause while you get your notebook out, go ahead, that's fine. And then when you're ready to take notes, go ahead and click the button again and we can start taking notes. The first question we have to ask ourselves is what trends existed within our country before the Civil War? And again, we're focusing on the African American population of our country. Before the Civil War, in our nation's first census, our nation conducted its first census in 1790. And in 1790, 1 out of 5 people in the United States were African American. 1 out of 5, 20% of people in the United States were African American. A great majority, over 90% of them, as slaves. The concentration of African Americans was highest in southern states. In other words, there were more African Americans living in southern states than there were living in northern states. The 2 southern states that had the highest concentration of African Americans was South Carolina at 54%. What I mean by that is 54% of the people that lived in South Carolina were African American. And almost all of that percent of African Americans were slaves. If you think about that for a second, that means that in South Carolina in 1790, there were more African Americans living in South Carolina than there were European Americans. The second state with the highest concentration of African Americans in 1790 was Virginia. In Virginia, 40%, 4 out of 10, 2 out of 5 people living in Virginia were African American before the Civil War. The Civil War is going to impact our country's history tremendously. And so in our next question, we're going to look at how did the population of African Americans shift in our country after the Civil War. So our next question is just simply, what trends existed after the Civil War in our country all the way up until World War I? As a result of the Civil War, African Americans were no longer slaves. Slavery was banned in our country after or during the Civil War. Even though slavery was banned, most African Americans remained in the South. After the Civil War, 90% of the African Americans who were living in the South stayed in the South. Now, many of you might be asking yourself, why wouldn't African Americans leave the South where they were slaves? The reason, there's actually two reasons. One of those reasons is that they found work right there for themselves in the South. They either worked as tenant farmers, in other words, they worked for a plantation owner and were paid, or they were sharecroppers, where they worked for a plantation owner, with the plantation owner getting a portion of the crops and the African American receiving a portion of the crops. Many of the African Americans were unaware of economic opportunities available in other parts of the country. In other words, yes, there were job openings, there were possible job openings in the North, or there was land available in the West, but many African Americans weren't aware of those possibilities or weren't willing to leave the comforts of their familiar surroundings. Matter of fact, labor unions in the northern states, now remember what a labor union is. A labor union is an organization of workers. Labor unions in the northern states actually weren't promoting African Americans to come to the northern cities to work. They were actually trying to get immigrants from Europe to come to America to work in their to work in the factories. Even though African Americans were freed during the Civil War, I don't want you to think that prejudice went away. Prejudice existed in our country towards African Americans for years and years following the Civil War. Well, the next question we have to answer is, all right, well, what happens to African Americans after World War I? So let's look in, our next question will be, what happened in our country, what happened to the distribution of African Americans in our country during World War I? And World War I was fought in the 19-teens up into the 1960s. Now, this is when we're going to see a large migration of African Americans out of the South. The African American population in the southern states is going to drop between World War I and the 1960s. During World War I, all the way into the 1960s, there is going to be a huge demand for workers in northern states, in the factories in northern states. During World War I, in which millions of men were entered or drafted into the military, there was a shortage of labor in the northern cities, so much of a shortage of labor that immigration from Europe was pretty much at a standstill. So at this point, factories were promoting the idea of African Americans working in factories. So many African Americans left the southern states and traveled up to northern states looking for work in factories. At the same time that companies were hiring African American workers in the north, the mechanization of the cotton industry also forced some African Americans to leave the South. What do I mean by the mechanism of the cotton industry? Before the mechanism of the cotton industry, most cotton had to be picked by hand, very labor intensive. However, with the invention of cotton picking machines, the demand for labor, the need for labor in the cotton fields declined incredibly. African Americans who did travel to northern cities tended to live in what we call ethnic neighborhoods. In other words, they tended to move into neighborhoods where there were already other African Americans. I know for us that live out here in Saunders County and Dodge County, sometimes we have a difficult time imagining this. But think of some of the towns around Fremont and Cedar Bluffs. Oakland, Nebraska was predominantly settled by Swedes. Prague, Nebraska was predominantly settled by Czechs. Wahoo, Nebraska was predominantly settled by Czechs and Poles. Cedar Bluffs was predominantly settled by Germans. Why is this so? Well, immigrants would come over and they wanted to live next to people that had commonalities with them, shared a common culture. So when African Americans moved to northern cities, they too were looking for neighborhoods that shared a common culture. So ethnic neighborhoods were being established in northern cities. They had already been they were already there. There were ethnic neighborhoods for the Czechs and for the Poles and the Germans and the Irish and the Italians. African Americans were looking to form their own ethnic neighborhood. From the let me go back to ethnic neighborhoods. Let me kind of help you out. In Omaha, the ethnic neighborhood was in the northern part of Omaha. In Kansas City, the ethnic neighborhood for African Americans was located in the southern part of Kansas City. In Chicago, can't tell you. I forgot what part of Chicago is. I don't want to give you information that I can't remember off the top of my head. Well, from the 1940s to the 1970s, a huge I'm not going to use the word huge. There was a migration of African Americans to California from the 1940s to the 1970s. Because of the availability of agricultural jobs and industrial jobs, the demand for jobs led many African Americans to California.